John Matheson had always been a man of few words. After decades of serving his country as a Special Forces sniper, he craved nothing more than peace and quiet. That's why he bought the old ranch nestled deep in the countryside, miles away from the noise of city life. The land was sprawling, rugged, and untouched, just how he liked it. He spent his days fixing fences, tending to his horses, and working on an old tractor that seemed to have more rust than metal. It wasn't glamorous, but for John, it was perfect. The only downside: his nearest neighbors were part of an upscale gated community about 2 miles down the road. They weren't bad people, necessarily, but they lived by a strict set of rules enforced by their homeowners association, or HOA. At first, John didn't think much of them. He kept to himself, rarely venturing into their world of manicured lawns and shiny cars. But soon enough, they started noticing him, or rather, his property. It began innocently enough. A note taped to his mailbox: "Please maintain your grass within HOA guidelines." Then another: "Tractor parked too close to the road violates safety regulations." John chuckled at the absurdity of it all. He wasn't even part of their fancy HOA, so why should he care? Still, he figured it wouldn't hurt to humor them. He cut the grass when it got too long and moved the tractor farther back from the road. Problem solved. Or so he thought. That's when Karen Winslong entered his life. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, known for her sharp tongue and unrelenting determination to enforce every single rule, no matter how trivial. To Karen, John's ranch was a blight on the otherwise pristine neighborhood. Overgrown fields? Check. Rusty equipment? Double check. And don't even get her started on the way his mailbox leaned slightly to one side. It was practically an abomination in her eyes. Karen made it her mission to bring John in line. She left increasingly snarky notes, each one laced with thinly veiled threats about fines and legal action. When those failed to produce results, she took matters into her own hands, filing formal complaints with the HOA board. Every meeting became a tirade against that man who refused to play by the rules. Some of her fellow homeowners rolled their eyes behind her back, but most stayed silent, unwilling to challenge her authority. For John, though, Karen's antics barely registered. He'd faced far worse things in his life than passive-aggressive notes. Sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, he often watched her drive past in her spotless SUV, glaring at his property like it had personally offended her. He found her behavior almost comical, shaking his head as she sped off in a huff. Little did he know, Karen's obsession with him was about to take a darker turn, and that her relentless pursuit of perfection would push her straight into dangerous territory. John's peaceful existence was about to be shattered, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. Karen Winslow wasn't used to being ignored. In her world, rules were sacred, and anyone who dared to break them, or worse, disregard them entirely, was a problem that needed fixing. John Matheson's refusal to bow to her demands didn't just irritate her, it infuriated her. To Karen, his nonchalance was a personal insult, a challenge to her authority. And challenges, in her mind, required escalation. At first, she stuck to what she did best, leaving notes, but these weren't the polite reminders of before. Now they were laced with thinly veiled threats. "Failure to comply will result in legal action," one read. Another warned, "This is your final notice." Each note was meticulously typed, signed with her name, and taped securely to John's mailbox. She even added little exclamation points for emphasis, as if that would make him take her more seriously. But John didn't budge. He glanced at the notes, sometimes chuckling or shaking his head, and then tossed them into the trash. The truth was, he found Karen's persistence amusing. After everything he'd seen and done in his life, her campaign against his overgrown grass and leaning mailbox felt laughably small. Still, he couldn't deny that her behavior was starting to wear on him. It wasn't the notes themselves. It was the principle of it all. Who was this woman to dictate how he lived on his own land? When her written warnings failed, Karen decided it was time for face-to-face confrontations. She began showing up unannounced at John's property line, standing just far enough away to avoid trespassing, but close enough to shout. Her voice carried across the open fields, sharp and shrill, listing every rule he'd supposedly broken. "You're ruining our neighborhood," she yelled one afternoon, hands on her hips. "Do you have any idea how much your mess lowers property values?" John usually responded with silence, watching her from a distance. Occasionally, he'd offer a dry comment. "If you don't like my grass, feel free to mow it yourself," he said once, smirking as he leaned against his porch railing. Karen sputtered in frustration, unable to comprehend why he wasn't cowering under her verbal assault. Instead of backing down, though, she grew bolder, visiting more frequently and raising her voice louder each time. Her behavior didn't go unnoticed by others in the community. Some neighbors whispered about how out of control Karen was getting, while others defended her, saying John should at least try to meet her halfway. A few even joined her crusade, nodding along when she complained during HOA meetings. "We can't let one person ruin everything we've worked for," she declared passionately, pointing to photos of John's ranch she printed out for dramatic effect. Despite the growing pressure, John refused to engage further. He knew people like Karen, people who thrived on conflict and drama. Giving her what she wanted would only encourage her. So he kept doing what he'd always done, living his life on his terms. But deep down, he started to wonder where this would all lead. How far was Karen willing to go? And more importantly, what would happen when she realized her tactics weren't working? As days turned into weeks, the tension between them simmered just below the surface. Karen's frustration reached new heights, and John's patience began to wear thin. Neither of them knew it yet, but their standoff was about to reach a breaking point, one that neither could have anticipated. The quiet countryside, once a refuge for John, was about to become the stage for something far more explosive. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn evening, when the golden hues of sunset bathed John's ranch in warm light. He had spent the day repairing a section of fence that had been knocked over by a stray deer. Exhausted but satisfied with his work, he decided to call it an early night. As he pulled into his driveway, something caught his eye. A jagged piece of metal lying near his mailbox. It was what remained of the wooden post Karen had complained about so often. His jaw tightened as he stepped out of his truck to inspect the damage. The mailbox itself was completely destroyed, its twisted remains scattered across the ground. But that wasn't all. Spray painted across his driveway in bold red letters were words meant to provoke. "Clean up or else." The message was crude and unmistakably personal. Someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. John didn't need to guess who was behind it. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was harassment and vandalism. For the first time since Karen's crusade began, John felt a flicker of anger. He wasn't one to dwell on emotions, but even he could recognize when someone had gone too far. Instead of reacting impulsively, though, he did what he always did, assessed the situation calmly. He retrieved his phone and snapped photos of the scene, documenting every detail. Then he walked back inside and grabbed a flashlight to examine the perimeter of his property. Sure enough, tire tracks led from the road straight to his driveway, evidence that whoever had done this hadn't bothered to hide their actions. They wanted him to know it was deliberate. That night, John made a decision. If Karen, or anyone else, thought they could intimidate him, they were wrong. He rummaged through his storage shed and found an old security camera system he'd never bothered to install. Over the next few hours, he mounted the cameras strategically around his property, ensuring there wouldn't be any blind spots. By morning, his ranch was under surveillance, ready to catch anyone foolish enough to trespass again. But Karen wasn't done. Her obsession with John had consumed her, turning her frustration into something darker. Late that same night, fueled by anger and perhaps a drink or two, she convinced herself that confrontation was the only way to resolve things. She grabbed a baseball bat from her garage, Not because she planned to use it, she told herself, but because it made her feel powerful. Clutching the bat tightly, she climbed into her car and drove toward John's ranch. When she arrived, adrenaline coursed through her veins. The gate leading to his property was unlocked, which she saw as an invitation rather than a warning. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and marched onto his land, her footsteps heavy with determination. In her mind, she imagined herself as a crusader for justice, finally putting an end to John's defiance. What she didn't realize was that she was walking straight into territory where she didn't belong, and that John had been watching her every move since she stepped foot on his property. As Karen advanced toward the house, bat in hand, she shouted into the darkness, "John, you think you can ignore me? You think you're above the rules?" Her voice echoed across the silent fields, bouncing back at her like a challenge. Unbeknownst to her, John stood just inside his doorway, listening intently. He knew exactly what kind of person Karen was now. Reckless, entitled, and dangerously unpredictable. And while he didn't want trouble, he also knew better than to underestimate someone like her. Karen's invasion marked a shift in their conflict. This wasn't about HOA rules or property values anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and control. For John, it was clear that Karen had no intention of backing down, but neither did he. As the tension reached its peak, both of them were about to learn just how high the stakes really were and how far they were willing to go. Karen stormed onto John's property like a force of nature, her voice slicing through the quiet night. "John," she screamed, her words sharp and uneven. "You can't keep ignoring me. This ends now." Her boots crunched against the gravel driveway as she marched closer to the house, the baseball bat swinging menacingly in her hand. The moonlight caught the glint of determination and recklessness in her eyes. She was past reasoning, past caring about consequences. All that mattered to her was making John pay for defying her. Inside the house, John stood motionless, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light spilling from the doorway. He had seen this moment coming. Karen's escalating behavior over the weeks had left little doubt that she would eventually push things too far. But now that it was here, he felt no fear, only calm resolve. Decades of training had taught him how to handle situations like this, where emotions ran high and rationality faded. He didn't move immediately, letting her come closer, watching her every step. "Put the bat down, Karen," John finally spoke, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the chaos of her shouting. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with authority that few people could ignore. But Karen didn't listen. If anything, his calm demeanor infuriated her more. "Don't tell me what to do," she snapped, raising the bat slightly as if to emphasize her point. "You've disrespected me, disrespected this neighborhood, and you're going to regret it." With that, she lunged forward, swinging the bat wildly in his direction. To an outsider, it might have looked intimidating. A woman charging at a man twice her size, weapon in hand. But John saw something else entirely. Someone out of control, acting without thought or strategy. In one fluid motion, he sidestepped her swing, closing the distance between them before she could react. His movements were precise, efficient, the result of years spent mastering combat techniques in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Before Karen knew what hit her, the bat was wrenched from her grasp, clattering harmlessly to the ground. A second later, she found herself pinned face down on the gravel, John's weight pressing gently, but firmly against her back. Her shouts turned into muffled protests as she struggled beneath him, realizing for the first time just how badly she'd underestimated him. "Do you have any idea who I am?" John whispered, his tone icy and measured. He leaned in close enough for her to hear, but not so close as to seem threatening. It was a calculated move, designed to drive home the reality of the situation. For the first time since she'd set foot on his property, Karen froze. Fear replaced fury as the enormity of what she'd done sank in. She stammered, trying to explain herself, but her words came out jumbled and weak. I didn't mean. I just wanted. Her bravado evaporated, leaving behind only panic. John said nothing, giving her a moment to process the gravity of her actions. When he finally released her, she scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt off her clothes while avoiding eye contact. "You don't belong here, Karen," John said simply, his voice softer now, but still unwavering. "Go home before this gets worse." For once, Karen didn't argue. Without another word, she turned and hurried toward her car, her earlier confidence shattered. As her taillights disappeared down the driveway, John exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body. The confrontation was over. For now, but he knew the fallout would linger. What happened next wouldn't just affect him and Karen, it would ripple through the entire community, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their neighbors. In that moment, standing alone under the starlit sky, John realized something important. Peace wasn't always about avoiding conflict. Sometimes it was about knowing when to stand your ground and when to let others learn from their mistakes. After Karen fled into the night, John didn't waste any time. He reached for his phone and dialed the local sheriff's department, explaining the situation in a calm, matter-of-fact tone. "Someone trespassed on my property," he said. "She broke my mailbox earlier, and tonight she came onto my land with a weapon. I've got it all on camera." The dispatcher assured him that deputies would be there shortly, and true to their word, flashing lights appeared at the end of his driveway within minutes. When the officers arrived, John greeted them politely, offering a clear and concise account of what had happened. He showed them the damaged mailbox, the spray-painted driveway, and the footage from his newly installed security cameras. The evidence was undeniable. Karen Winslow had crossed a line, and not just figuratively. She'd broken laws. As the deputies reviewed the tapes, one of them glanced at John curiously. "You handled yourself pretty well out here," he remarked. John shrugged, brushing off the comment. "I just did what I had to do. But I think you should know something about me before we go further." With that, he revealed his military background, not to boast, but to provide context. "I'm retired Special Forces," he explained. "Sniper, so trust me when I say I don't want trouble. But I also won't tolerate threats or trespassing." The deputies exchanged glances, clearly impressed. They knew John by reputation. His name carried weight in certain circles, and now they understood why he hadn't seemed rattled by Karen's antics. Still, they assured him they'd handle the matter professionally, taking detailed statements and collecting evidence before heading off to locate Karen. Meanwhile, news of the incident spread like wildfire through the gated community. Neighbors who had blindly supported Karen began to question her behavior. Some admitted privately that they'd always found her extreme, though they'd never dared to challenge her. Others felt guilty for enabling her crusade against John, realizing too late how petty and vindictive she had become. A few brave souls even approached John directly, apologizing for their role in the drama. "I'm sorry about all this," said one neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who brought over a plate of cookies as a peace offering. "We let Karen run wild because no one wanted to stand up to her. But none of us agreed with what she did tonight." John accepted the gesture graciously, appreciating the effort even if he remained cautious. "It's not your fault," he replied. "But maybe next time, speak up sooner." People like her thrive when everyone stays quiet. As days passed, Karen's arrest made headlines in the local paper. Charges of trespassing and vandalism were filed, along with an additional count of assault due to the baseball bat incident. The story quickly became gossip fodder, with neighbors dissecting every detail. At first, some tried to defend her, insisting she was just passionate about maintaining standards. But as more facts emerged, including the security footage showing her aggressive behavior, even her staunchest supporters began to distance themselves. Facing mounting legal fees and public humiliation, Karen retreated from the spotlight. She stopped attending HOA meetings, avoided social gatherings, and kept to herself. Her once imposing presence dwindled into near invisibility. For many residents, it was a relief. For others, it served as a sobering reminder of how quickly power could corrupt. Through it all, John remained unfazed. While he appreciated the apologies and gestures of goodwill from his neighbors, he wasn't naive enough to believe everything had changed overnight. He knew that communities like theirs often operated on unspoken hierarchies, and Karen's downfall might simply create space for someone else to step into her shoes. Still, he hoped her actions would serve as a lesson, not just to her, but to everyone watching, that rules meant to foster harmony shouldn't be wielded as weapons of control. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, John reflected on the events of the past weeks. He hadn't asked for conflict, but neither had he backed down when it came knocking. In standing his ground, he'd not only protected himself, but also reminded those around him of an important truth. Respect works both ways, and sometimes silence speaks louder than words ever could. In the weeks following Karen's arrest, life in the gated community began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways. The once oppressive atmosphere Karen had cultivated started to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of reflection among the residents. For years, they had allowed her to dominate their meetings, dictate their decisions, and enforce rules with an iron fist, all without questioning whether her methods were fair or reasonable. Now, stripped of her influence, people began to realize just how much they had tolerated, and even enabled, her behavior. John noticed the change almost immediately. Neighbors who had previously ignored him now waved as they drove past his ranch. Some went further, stopping by to introduce themselves properly. A young couple brought over a basket of fresh-baked bread, thanking him for standing up to Karen. An elderly man named Harold invited John to join him for coffee at the local diner, saying, "It's about time someone put that woman in her place." At first, John was cautious. He appreciated the gestures but remained wary of ulterior motives. After all, these were the same people who had let Karen wage her campaign against him for months. Still, he decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. Over time, he found himself engaging more with the community, not because he craved connection, but because it felt like the right thing to do. When Linda organized a neighborhood barbecue, she personally extended an invitation to John, insisting he come. To everyone's surprise, he accepted. The event was held on a sunny Saturday afternoon, with tables set up under string lights in the communal park. John arrived late, dressed casually in jeans and a flannel shirt, drawing curious glances from some attendees. At first, conversations paused when he approached, but soon enough, his calm demeanor and dry sense of humor put people at ease. Someone asked him about his military service, and while John didn't divulge too many details, he shared stories of his travels and adventures. His tales of far-off places captivated the crowd, painting a picture of a man who had seen the world and chosen this quiet corner of it as his refuge. For the first time in years, John felt a flicker of belonging. It wasn't overwhelming or dramatic. Rather, it was small moments that made the difference. A genuine laugh shared with Harold, a heartfelt thank you from Linda, or the sight of children playing freely in the grass. These interactions reminded him that not everyone shared Karen's toxic mindset. Most people simply wanted to live peacefully, enjoying the company of their neighbors without unnecessary drama. Karen's trial concluded a few months later, with a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge sentenced her to probation and ordered her to attend anger management classes. Though she avoided jail time, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Stripped of her authority and shunned by those she'd once controlled, Karen faded into obscurity. Her house sat empty for weeks before a for sale sign appeared in the yard, a silent testament to how quickly things could unravel. As for John, he chose not to press additional charges against Karen. "She's learned her lesson," he told the sheriff when asked. "That's punishment enough." His decision earned him respect within the community, solidifying his role as someone who valued fairness over revenge. People admired his restraint, recognizing that he could have made life far worse for Karen if he wanted to, but he hadn't. Reflecting on everything that had happened, John realized something important. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. He would always remember the night Karen broke into his ranch with a bat, driven by anger and entitlement. But holding on to bitterness wouldn't serve him or anyone else. Instead, he focused on moving forward, finding peace in the simple joys of his daily routine and the growing connections with his neighbors. On quiet evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, John thought about how far he'd come. From the battlefields of war zones to the skirmishes of suburban life. Both experiences had taught him valuable lessons about human nature. That fear and insecurity often fueled aggression, and that standing your ground didn't mean seeking conflict. It meant protecting what mattered most. And in doing so, sometimes, you inspired others to do the same. Months after Karen's trial, life in the gated community settled into a rhythm that felt almost unrecognizable compared to the chaos of earlier days. The HOA meetings, once dominated by Karen's shrill voice and endless complaints, became quieter and more collaborative. Residents started voicing their opinions freely, no longer afraid of backlash or judgment. A younger couple volunteered to lead the group, bringing fresh ideas and a focus on fostering goodwill rather than enforcing trivial rules. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood transformed from a place ruled by fear to one built on mutual respect. For John Matheson, this shift was both unexpected and welcome. He hadn't intended to become a symbol of change, but his calm resolve during the conflict with Karen seemed to inspire others to rethink their priorities. Neighbors who had once dismissed him as a stubborn outsider now saw him as someone worth listening to, a man whose quiet strength spoke louder than words. They began seeking his advice on matters big and small, from resolving disputes to organizing community events. While John didn't seek attention, he found himself enjoying these interactions more than he'd anticipated. One crisp autumn morning, as John worked on repairing a section of fence near the edge of his property, Harold stopped by with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a break," he said, handing one over with a grin. The 2 men leaned against the fence, sipping their drinks and chatting about everything from weather patterns to local politics. It struck John how much had changed since the days when he'd felt like an outsider looking in. Now he was part of something, a community that, despite its flaws, was learning to grow together. Still, John remained vigilant. He knew better than most that trouble could arise again, whether from Karen or someone else determined to stir up drama. But instead of letting that possibility weigh him down, he chose to focus on what he could control, maintaining his land, nurturing his relationships, and living life on his own terms. The security cameras stayed in place, not out of paranoia, but as a reminder that boundaries mattered and should always be respected. Occasionally, rumors surfaced about Karen. Some said she'd moved out of state. Others claimed she was lying low, too embarrassed to show her face. Whatever the truth, her absence left a void that allowed the community to heal. In her absence, people rediscovered kindness and empathy, qualities that had been buried under years of tension and fear. On clear nights, John often sat on his porch, gazing at the stars. These moments gave him time to reflect on his journey. Not just the recent events, but the decades that had shaped him into the man he was today. He thought about the battles he'd fought overseas, the sacrifices he'd made, and the scars he carried, all invisible to those around him. Yet here he was, finding peace in a place he'd never expected, surrounded by people who were slowly becoming friends. John also recognized that his story wasn't unique. Everyone carried burdens, faced challenges, and made mistakes. What set people apart wasn't the adversity they encountered, but how they responded to it. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her actions. It was about her inability to adapt, to see beyond her own perspective. For John, this realization reinforced a simple truth. Growth came from humility, understanding, and a willingness to learn. As the seasons changed and winter approached, John prepared for colder months ahead, stacking firewood and checking his livestock. Life continued in its steady, predictable way, punctuated by occasional visits from neighbors and shared meals at holiday gatherings. Though he still cherished his solitude, he no longer felt isolated. Instead, he embraced the balance between independence and connection, a harmony he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When asked if he regretted anything about the ordeal with Karen, John shook his head. Things happen for a reason, he'd say with a faint smile. I wouldn't wish harm on anyone, but sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they can climb back up. And maybe the rest of us needed a wake-up call too. In the end, John's story wasn't just about standing his ground or teaching someone a lesson. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of leading by example. He proved that even in the face of hostility, compassion could prevail, and that sometimes the quietest voices carried the strongest messages. As he watched another sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, John felt at peace, knowing he'd done his part to create a better world, one small step at a time.